Okay, I think we are live. Sorry for the delay, everybody. We have been having some technical issues, unfortunately, but I think they'll be fixed in the meantime. So with a little delay, I'm very happy to moderate the panel today. We are small. It's not really a panel. It's more a small conversation amongst three experts in the field of Aquafeed, and we will be discussing the future of alternative proteins and oils today in this webinar. Having some technical issues. This is presented by aquafeed.com together with Hatch. My name is Carsten Krom. I'm a managing partner at Hatch. And before we go into the topic, I'd like to introduce myself and the panelists. Like I said, one of us, unfortunately, is still trying to dial in, but I'm sure it'll get fixed in the meantime. So let me start by introducing Clifford Bradley to you today. He is dialing in live from Montana. That's in the United States. And yes, Cliff, do you want to introduce yourself, please? In our audience here today, I'm hoping we can go into some detail when it comes to what's going to be new in alternative proteins and oils in aquafeeds. Yeah, maybe what's important to know is that Cliff will be representing sort of the protein side of things here today, since his company, Montana Microbial Products, is producing protein ingredient made of barley. And Ian, who's still trying to dial in, will be representing a company called Veramaris, which is sort of a larger joint venture that is in alternative omega-3 oils. So they are essentially providing a fish oil alternative for the market. And the two companies are sort of having probably some of the same struggles as being alternative feed ingredients suppliers in a sector that is still dominated by the conventional ingredients mainly. Although there's been obviously talks around alternative feed ingredients going on for quite a lot of time now, but the reality is they are not there yet in many cases. In others, they are making progress, and this is what we'd like to discuss today. But Cliff, could you maybe talk a little bit more about the product of Montana Microbial, where you are, what stage you are in with your company, and why barley protein is such an interesting product?
Thank you. Yes, we developed a process which we call enzymatic fractionation, I guess, for want of a better description. It's a biological enzymatic process to produce the process works with any grain or oilseed, but barley turned out to be the best for a variety of reasons. So we make a 65% protein concentrate from barley. Co-product of that is sugar, glucose, which has a number of valuable uses. The protein we've had through a whole variety of testing, feed testing, it's superior to soy protein concentrates in digestibility and protein availability. It's pretty much equivalent to fish meal in digestibility. We've had in trout and salmon 94% digestibility. It's very low in phosphorus, and the phosphorus that's in there is digestible, so it cuts the main pollutant from fish farming, and so that's been a big benefit as well. Barley turns out to be a very good feedstock for this sort of thing. It's the lowest value, lowest cost of the major grains. It's available in quantities that worldwide that could actually, one of the issues with protein for aquacultures, you have to play in a market that's 10 million tons. And barley is available in sufficient supply to be able to do that. And it's also a very low input sustainable crop. It's grown, I mean, we started in Montana with barley because that's one of the few things you can actually grow here where it's cold and dry. So it's a very sustainable, low input crop. It's not been genetically modified, which is an advantage in a number of markets. So that's the gist of the product. It's been through of a whole variety of feed trials in different species of fish, including trout and salmon and sea breams and a whole bunch of different species, including a commercial trial with 375,000 trout.
Because that's one thing I see a lot, Cliff, with new protein ingredients, that in trials they hold up for, say, 8 weeks, which is sort of the standard length of a trial, of any trial, and trials obviously get expensive over time, so it's often convenient or the only option you have to do an 8-week trial. But really, sometimes you can see how the performance of the treatment groups goes down, but it's still not statistically significant. And then you hear a lot of people say, well, this is, as good as fish meal. But if you were to look into the raw data in detail, you kind of see already a tendency. But in your case, what I find amazing is that you've actually done it for a whole life cycle, and the fish was sold, right? And it's 380,000 fish, correct?
Yeah, this was trout in South Idaho with one of the largest trout producers in the world, actually. Fed commercial raceways from fry to market weight and sold into commerce. As an aside, this has also been approved by the Food and Drug Administration as a feed ingredient, so we were able to do that from a trial.
Right.
And there was no difference in growth rates or fall off, like you say. Yeah, we've seen that in looking at the data from some kinds of studies. So we've never seen that. The fish do well through the whole cycle on the barley protein. That was the 30% inclusion rate. You run this at much higher inclusion rates than you can soy proteins, because the barley protein doesn't have the anti-nutritionals in it that show up in soy. So
is that a question of oil seeds in general versus the wheats and barleys of this world, or why is the anti-nutritional factors higher in soy than in barley?
I don't know.
Right.
Why it's high in soy? That's just a characteristic of the crop. That's what comes as other biochemistry in the crop. Barley, the protein is very pure and clean, if you will. There's no anti-nutritional. Like soy has saponins and stachyose and sugars that are not digestible. Other grains, oilseeds do have as well, to varying degrees. Grains much less so. In barley, it doesn't seem to show up at all.
Okay.
So we've run tests as high as 40% inclusion rates without any issues, where barley protein has been essentially the only protein.
And what stage do you think you are in the development of your company? Why is no one using barley protein yet?
Well,
is that happening soon?
It's happening soon. We have 2 license agreements in place now. One licensed technology in the U.S. and one in Europe. We're doing the engineering as we speak. My business partners in Europe working with engineers on that one. And we expect to be in commercial production both in the U.S. and in Europe in mid to late 2021, next year. I mean, we have sites picked out and engineering and progress here.
Great.
So this should be available next year.
Thanks, Cliff. We have Ian on the line now. Hi, Ian. Welcome.
Hi, Carsten. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you. Perfect. That's much better.
So, sorry for the complexities there. We're getting connected.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be a real Zoom call without these complexities, would it? So that's great. It always has to happen. There's no conference call where it doesn't happen. So let's face it. And this is only just another conference call. So, Ian, you represent Veramaris as Global Business Development Director. Could you please introduce yourself and your company in a few words?
Yeah, pleasure to be here. First of all, Carsten, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very pleased to represent Veramaris on this call. Veramaris is an extremely exciting company with an extremely exciting innovation. It's a joint venture between 2 of the real leaders in animal health and nutrition, with DSM on the one hand, famous for their carotenoids, their vitamin and premixes, eubiotics, those kind of things, and they brought to the joint venture the strains of algae that we're working with, amongst other things, and that's really the key contribution that DSM brings. On the other hand, Evonik, have obviously well known in the industry for their amino acids in particular. They bring world-class capabilities in fermentation technology. So with these two players combined, you have a fantastic set of capabilities to be able to leverage that microalgae that has its origins in the NASA research for space applications back in the 80s. 40 years on, we're in their position now to be able to bring part of that technology to market as a completely new source of omega-3 EPA and DHA in particular, both for aquaculture, for pets, also for livestock. This is a ready now innovation that's very much in the scale-up phase, and my role in that is to help with the business development. So try to understand what it is that the markets can apply this technology for, and help to create value through the chain by working with that. My personal background, I have about 30 years of experience in aquaculture. In the early days, producing rainbow trout, but for most of my years working in the feed business, particularly with the EWAS brand, and then lastly with Cargill. So yeah, pleasure to be here, Carsten. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Ian. One thing I'm always interested in, you say scale-up phase. Is there production going on at large scale right now, and is the ingredient being used by the industry at this stage currently?
Yes, it is. Yeah, last year we opened the full-scale facility in July of last year. A brand new, a repurposed facility actually in Blair, Nebraska. And that allowed us to move on from the pre-commercial facilities that we used to produce trial volumes of Algalore for a year or more before that. And we're now at a point where we can really deliver, a revolutionary alternative to alternative source of EPA and DHA, and people are using it now. We've got quite a few of the more courageous leaders, particularly in the salmon space, starting to use the technology.
Interesting. So you both, Cliff and Ian, you seem to be with your companies at a similar trajectory at the moment with regards to when your ingredients might end up being used as mainstream in the market, which is great. I just read the Cargill sustainability report last week, and the nice thing about the report is that they're quite transparent around what they have done and what they are falling short in still right now. And for example, one statistic is that since 2015, the alternative feed ingredients or new feed ingredients generally used in cold water species were about 5% of the total ingredients, and in warm water species it was only 1% or above, a little bit above 1%. So I'm wondering, I mean, this is 5 years. I've been around for maybe, let's say, 8 years in this sector talking about alternative ingredients. Why is it taking so long? What are the challenges that probably both of you will be or expect to face? Maybe Cliff.
Well, as a small company and undercapitalized, one of our challenges was raising capital for this adventure. That if you're going to go in the business of manufacturing protein, there's no way around having to build production facilities. So that took us a while. I'm not sure why the uptake is slow. One of the things that we've encountered in discussions with the industry, again, I'm relatively new to aquaculture, long in biochemistry, short on fish, and one of the criticisms I've heard of some of the alternative proteins is there's just not enough of it available to be a reliable supply at the volume some of the large players really need. And that's what maybe one of the barriers is. If 100 tons of a product doesn't really do much for you in this industry.
Right. And it's a chicken egg question in that case, right? Because yes. You have no revenue, you don't find financing because you have no revenue, but you can't get revenue unless you've got thousands and thousands of tons. So, but I think for both of you, this question is sort of solved, right? Which is amazing in the sense that there's hundreds of alternative protein and oil companies out there trying to find financing. You guys achieved that. You're building factories. What is the next challenge then? Ian, maybe give that to you.
I think the challenge now is for the industry to realize the opportunity in actually adopting these novel technologies at scale. As you rightly point out, up until recently, these have been either ideas on the bench or something under development or in the pre-commercial stages of production, and that's all well and good, but that doesn't give the industrial players the confidence that they need to adopt these raw materials and to start using them at scale. With Veramaris now, we're at the point where this is a tried and tested technology. All of the trials that need to be done upon safety and efficacy, have been done. Those have been published. We've not only independently, but also we've been through those processes with some of the key feed producers and others. So they know that this is a reliable, raw material that they can start to add into their routine formulation. And coupled with that, it also brings some, real advantages over the more conventional raw materials when you start looking at how do we, deal with this planetary health challenge that we're all facing. How do we make sure that we meet the healthiness needs of people, whilst at the same time balancing the needs of the environment and respecting the state of the natural systems and the resources upon which we all depend. So given that we're now at that stage and able to do this at scale, Carsten, I think that gives people the comfort that they can actually start to adopt this.
Right. One thing that I always find striking, there's about a 10-to-1 ratio between new protein ingredients to new oil ingredients, protein being just so much more. And the new oil ingredients, there seems to be only heterotrophic algae as opposed to photoautotrophic, which seem to be one order of magnitude too expensive. And then there's the genetically modified oil seeds, such as the one that Cargill has deregulated, I believe, last year. Ian, who do you think is your biggest competitor in finding fish oil alternatives or in producing fish oil alternatives?
Well, I think there's a place for all of these technologies, Carsten, in one way or another. The advantage that Veramaris has is that it's a very potent product. It has more than 50% concentrated with both EPA and DHA, and that's important too because many of the technologies that have come to market before have only DHA, and they are. But
that's actually a good question. Do you need EPA? No one can ever tell me whether you need it or not, and it seems to be even species dependent. And there's a lot of discussions out there amongst the academic community whether that's actually needed or not. Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, I think there's more and more papers being published on that, and more research agendas. Some of the biggest institutions actually looking at that. And what we know for sure is that the fish are not effective or efficient at desaturating DHA to EPA. They don't do that efficiently. And the two molecules have completely different functions. DHA is very important as a structural building block, whereas on the other hand, EPA is more of a functional molecule, and it's critical when you look at some of the inflammatory diseases that, for example, the salmon industry is facing through production. You need to have EPA in there in order to produce the icosanoids to help to have that anti-inflammatory effect. So both of these molecules are important.
Right. Do you guys face any regulatory issues? Cliff, maybe do you expect any with your enzymatic process?
No. Nothing insurmountable. I mean, these the protein ingredients have to be approved by regulatory agencies wherever you go. I mean, this is approved as a feed ingredient by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and the determination that it was generally recognized as safe. We're in the process of going through that regulatory approvals in other countries now. We're working with our partners, licensed partners on that. There's no serious barriers. You just have to do it.
Right.
And
because that's always the big unknown for the investment community anyway, because that's the one piece no one really seems to be able to give an answer to. And yeah.
It's been reasonably straightforward in the U.S. I mean, when you get through our process, basically there's nothing in there except barley, water, and enzymes. So it's not a complicated process, and barley's an established feed ingredient all over the world. So it's fairly straightforward. You just have to do it, and different countries have different requirements for approving efficacy results, and we've been working on that as well. So the only major issues we've run into are with diseases in barley. I mean, you can, like wheat and other grains, you can get diseases, plant diseases that produce toxins. So we have to, quality control was a big issue, and we've been able to deal with that quite effectively.
Right. Okay. And Ian, how does that look for you, the regulatory question?
Yeah, it's as Cliff says, it varies from market to market. We're already able to supply the product as a feed material in Europe. So, that was the first market where we got a foothold. We recently got GRAS approval in the US. So this is now, we're now interestingly able to distribute the algal oil that we produce in the US to markets within the US, which is great. And when it comes to markets in Central America and Asia and so on, you have to go one by one. Some of them require registration, some of them don't. Some of them you have to get an import license, some of them you don't. So you just have to take it step by step. But I think we've got most of the information that we need now in order to go through those processes.
Okay, yeah. And then obviously the elephant in the room then is always how do you compete on price with conventional ingredients? And I don't even want to ask for any detailed information because you wouldn't give it to me. I know that, but generally, what I always hear in venture capital when companies pitch their new solutions, it's always that sustainability premium that they expect to get from the market. And I know for a fact that it doesn't exist in commodity feeds. So this is sad, but I wonder whether there is, because we all know that, those people that know Aquafeed know that, for example, the El Niño phenomenon makes fish meal more expensive on every 4 to 5 year basis. We all know that through the COVID, the supply chains coming from South America to Europe isn't the ideal solution. So local supply chains will, create or will be in more focus. And I wonder, both of you are able to do away with both of those risks. And I wonder whether the market is willing to pay a premium for that. But how can you quantify that premium? Do you have any information on that? Are they willing to take this into account, Ian, or are they still reluctant?
Yeah, no. I mean, obviously that's a dialogue you have to have with each and every prospect. But at the end of the day, one of the points I would make is that never mind the cost. What about the opportunity cost of not doing this? What's the potential cost of not acting now and actually starting to adopt these technologies so that we're able to continue that fantastic growth story that aquaculture is. And if we rest on our laurels and rely only upon the resources that have brought us to the stage that we're at now, I doubt very much whether we're going to be able to realize the full potential of the industry, as it stands today. So, that's a little bit dodging the question. I mean, but I generally think the opportunity cost of not acting now is so big we can't afford to overlook it. But to address your question directly, Carsten, I think there's also, there's a potential to add value through the chain by being smart with the formulation and adopting some of these technologies to address both the healthiness of the product that we're producing, the healthiness of the fish, and in our case, that's the omega-3 level of the fish, which we know has declined, over the recent years, but also to make a proposition around sustainability. And we know that consumers are looking for that because they have concerns about aquaculture as it's done today.
But this is interesting that you're mentioning that, because you said in the prep call last week, you said that there should be a collaborative effort to push these kind of sustainable products into the market. So by collaborative, I mean throughout the whole supply chain. But what does that really mean? Because you're saying, so right now, rapeseed oil has replaced fish oil to a large extent in salmon feeds, simply because it's possible, and it reduces the cost by so much and the consumers don't really mined to that extent. You still need a little bit omega-3s in there to keep growth rates high, but you don't really need it for consumers who still think that there's omega-3 in there. Let's not, kid ourselves. This is misinformation almost. So your product could actually help increase these omega-3 levels again. So what wouldn't it make sense to go to the consumer directly for you? And talk alliances with the supermarkets, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the way that we're working, our go-to-market model at the moment is to collaborate right the way through the chain. And so it's a little bit beyond our capabilities to sell direct to consumers, and therefore we talk to retailers and food service players and say, well, what is it that you could sell? What are your consumers interested in? And that varies from market to market, from retailer to retailer. Once you understand that, are they concerned about healthiness, or are they concerned about sustainability, or are they concerned about food safety? And all of these elements, you can then make a proposition and work that back through the chain, talking to the processors,
right,
talking to the distributors, talking to the farmers and the feed millers, and specify a product that's fit for the market opportunity that you've diagnosed in a way.
Yes, because amongst you two, you could come up with a soy-free, higher omega-3 salmon that certain high-end supermarket chains would probably be happy to promote. Because I've always been wondering when in these conversations about the supply chain, who really does set the tone? Because it's not the feed manufacturers, right? The feed manufacturers, the profit pools these days are with the salmon farmers, and the salmon farmers, they, if you offer them a more expensive feed, they go to competition. At least that's my information. So the people that set the tone here are the salmon farmers, but how do the salmon farmers get convinced that this is the right solution for them? And I think that only works through influencing their customers, really. Is that correct? Would you agree with that? Yeah.
I think it depends on the situation. I think sometimes, when you're talking about more commoditized production, the farmer is setting the specification and the market chooses whether it wants to buy it or not. But I think that's changing now, and more you're seeing, retailers and food service players seeing the opportunity for food with a story, and consumers care, about what they're buying. They care about the sustainability. They care that when they're buying a piece of salmon, their expectation is that they get their weekly intake of omega-3s from that piece of salmon, and so they care about that, and they want to be sure that that's actually what they're getting. So this reality means that players at the end of the value chain more and more are actually setting the specification and then going out to market and say, okay, who's going to supply me with this?
Right. Okay. Well, maybe another question now. How do you think that the current global situation is going to affect your individual businesses in terms of the COVID-19? Cliff, is that good or bad?
I have no idea. I certainly it's cut the short-term demand for seafood, which goes heavily into restaurants. And I don't know about the rest of the world, but nobody in the U.S. is going to restaurants right now. So how long those things carry forward, it's hard to tell. But I think it, like you mentioned earlier, it has exposed the fragility of supply chains. We can't be shipping soy across the ocean to Europe and then bringing salmon from Norway to the U.S. by airplane. So I think that one evolution here is going to be much more localized and diverse production, which probably feeds back to more localized and diversified sources of protein and oil. The industry now relies on fish meal from 3 or 4 places in the world and soy from Brazil, and we need to diversify that much more. So I think that's going to be one of the effects, but it's going to take some time.
Right. But certainly from that perspective, it just accelerates your development as a company potentially.
Yes, it does. Yeah. I mean, that one of the advantages of barley is it's a worldwide commodity, except for Asia pretty much. But it's available in large quantities in North America and South America and Europe. So production can be, and actually it makes economic sense to produce the protein close to the barley as opposed to close to market. But as in, we've looked at places. There's a lot of places in the world where there's both fish and barley produced in the same regions. So I think that'll be good for our business.
Have either of you seen, maybe back to Ian, have you seen any impact of your ingredient on the flesh quality and flavor of the product?
Certainly nothing negative, Carsten. There's been multiple sensory analysis studies done, on fish that were produced during the pre-commercial stages, and then also, those who are using it now as business as usual are continually testing the taste and the texture of the fish that's being produced. So we certainly don't pick up anything negative there.
Okay. How about you, Cliff?
Similar. We've had fish produced with the barley protein through taste panels, and nobody could tell the difference.
Right.
So we're still working on that more, but so far there's been no effect on flavor or flesh quality in trout and salmon.
Perfect. Well, so let's go to some audience questions that I was texted by my colleague. Cliff, you said the barley protein's low in phosphorus. Where does the rest of the phosphorus go? Into the glucose byproduct or as a wastewater effluent from the process?
Well, two things. One is barley and most grains have very little phosphorus in them to begin with compared to, say, fish meal. And the phosphorus in grains like barley comes in the form of phytic acid, which is not digestible. The conversion process we use converts that to available phosphorus, and it's actually growing fish need a certain amount of phosphorus, and that's where it goes. It ends up in fish bones. And in some of the studies where we've used very high inclusion rates of the barley protein, they've actually had to supplement with a little bit of phosphorus to keep growth rates of the fish. So the phosphorus effluent is essentially zero from the barley protein.
Right. Another question for you, Cliff. How competitive do you perceive the supply chain and cost of inputs to be for barley relative to other feed alternatives, given malt industry demands?
Our strategy has been and all our economics say we can market this competitive with soy protein concentrates. One of the advantages of the process we developed is the co-products from it are pretty valuable. So that helps us, gives us a lot of room to maneuver in pricing this. So it will be.
But can you elaborate on the co-products, or is this still confidential what those are?
No, the co-product is essentially glucose. What we're doing is converting all the carbohydrates in barley, the starch and cellulose and everything else, solubilizing it with enzymes, and the co-product is glucose, and that in the U.S. is going to be as a replacement for molasses and dairy feeds, which cuts supply chains a lot. There's a lot of local economics around that are making sense. It could be used to produce ethanol. We're also talking to some green chemical companies using this as glucose as a feedstock for producing higher value chemicals by fermentation. We could probably even sell some to Veramaris for their algae production. If they're growing algae with glucose, we could
yeah. Let's set up another joint venture in this call.
Yeah.
I want to cut though because I'm moderating. Okay. Cliff, another one for you. Did you test that's a good one. Did you test the processability of barley protein concentrate in the extruder, essentially in the aquafeed production? Because oftentimes, or sometimes, so for wheat gluten, I hear that's a limiting factor because you're running into mechanical issues.
We did. We ran a whole series of tests on pelleting and extrusion. One of the partners we had in developing this was a fish nutritionist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they operated a pilot scale fish feed laboratory, and we collaborated with them on how to formulate feeds. We also worked with a Norwegian group that came to Montana and worked on feeds. And actually, the barley protein makes a very good pellet. It was superior to a lot of other pelleting, and I don't know the mechanics of all that, but extrusion tests and tests through pneumatic feeding systems through long distance feed systems and salmon, it worked quite well.
Great, thank you. Maybe a question for Ian. With the current rapid advancement in entoculture, so insect production technologies, how will all of these alternative protein sources compete or complement each other? I know this is protein, Ian, but I'm sure you've got something to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I said earlier on, I think they all have a place. They have to all contribute to, the growth that we need in aquaculture, because the FAO tells us that we need to grow aquaculture 6 times by 2050. So we're going to need a lot of protein to be able to do that. And we need different sources. We need to have a much more differentiated basket of raw materials that we're using in future compared to what we've had in the past, where we've been rather reliant upon 2 or 3 key ingredients, and that's not a particularly sustainable place to be. So I think, insect meal will have its certain set of features and benefits. Barley protein concentrate will have its features and benefits, and similarly in the oil space, our algal oil, very pure, very clean, very potent, and you have other technologies that compete against that. So I think there's a place for all of them, and they compete on their merits.
But do you think it might make sense to have some sort of association of alternative feed ingredient providers? Because it seems like everyone is having similar problems, and everyone's really needs to sort of find solutions for the same issues. Those are mainly market based, and the fact that it's still very difficult on a just cost perspective to compete. And I wonder whether there might be ways to somehow join up in this struggle.
It could be, Carsten. It could be that there's areas of common ground where novel ingredient players can come together. I'll tell you one area where that might be relevant is in LCA and the environmental sustainability credentials of all of these.
This is actually a great point, because I also think that there's oftentimes misinformation out on life cycle analysis of the different alternative ingredients, because they're not all equally good, right? There's some that are much better than others, and the existing feed ingredients, depending on how you measure it, also don't by definition all have a bad footprint. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the life cycle analysis part. Did you do that for your company, Ian? Did Veramaris do that?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's been done. It's been done according to the ISO standards, and it's been critically reviewed by, in our case, TÜV Rheinland in Germany. So we've had the right level of diligence on it. But there's still and I see many of the other players in the novel ingredient space doing a similar thing. But then I read papers, like there was a meta-analysis recently published, or maybe not that recently now, but looking across all of the different LCA studies that were done and saying that really there could be more consistency in the approach that's taken and the assumptions that are made within that, so that they're more comparable. And that then would arm people who are looking to adopt these technologies with the apples with apples comparison that they need in order to make informed choices. Because for sure there are trade-offs, involved in the formulation when you swap out one ingredient to replace it with another.
Yeah, understood. A question from Radmilo. Maybe back to Cliff. Can you predict when it would be logical to expect these ingredients to be standard part of diet formulations? How many years? I know you can talk for yourself only, but
yeah, I think it could be. It's going to be standard parts of formulations for trout industry in the U.S. Beginning next year. I think what I see is that probably starting. I don't see it going to feeds at a 30% inclusion rate and at time zero, I expect that it probably will start at lower inclusion rates and work up as companies get used to it. And I expect the same thing to happen in salmon. Nobody's gonna change their feed that drastically in one step, but I think it'll evolve fairly quickly because of cost advantages and issues with fish meal. One of again, a lot of our experience working with trout producers in the U.S., they're importing fish meal from South America, and they're at the end of that supply chain, and there's been times where they've not been able to get fish meal and had to curtail production. And the price ranges anywhere from $900 to $2,000 a ton, and that's their major cost. And one advantage that we've seen is talking to potential customers is the supply and the price are predictable for the barley protein, and I think that will help more rapid adoption. But again, it's going to be it's going to take several years to really get people up to see the full value of it.
True, but back to the Cargill sustainability report that I was referring to at the beginning, 5% new ingredients, which is likely all plant protein concentrates since 2015, isn't much. So I think in the next 5 years, from what I hear today, but also from what I see in the market, I think we'll see a much larger jump in that compared to the last 5 years. I mean, both of you are close. Yeah.
I think so. Again, it's been an issue of supply. When we can have, we're going to have 60 or 70,000 tons of this available beginning next year, and that is enough to make a difference in the market. Whereas I think that's been one of the issues some of the insect or single cell protein companies have dealt with, is just not being able to produce enough to really penetrate those markets. And so but there was a reason for that, right? There is a reason for that, and that is financing, but also the financing is difficult to get if it's tough to compete with the conventional ingredients in terms of price. Yeah. And that again is an advantage I think we have, is that we can compete on price with it.
Right.
So
because fish meal, like lots of projects happened about 7 years ago because people expected fish meal to increase, 5 to 7% per year. But fish meal has, I think it increased lately a little bit again, but it's been fairly stagnant over the last 5 years. Yeah. So there was a question from Emil Lindfors. Do you see any support potentially also from the regulatory body? So essentially the authority saying there could be limits as to how many ingredients, for example, can be imported from South America, or there can be certifications put in place that ban certain soy production or fish meal sourcing. Any maybe additional support that you could expect from people making lawmakers? Ian?
Yes. For me, for sure, absolutely. I think these guys need to catch up a little bit with what's possible in the industry these days, and some of that I see in the new EU farm to fork strategy, starting to sort of point to the adoption of new technologies a little bit faster. But it's really been tracking behind, in my opinion, and not only in terms of regulations, but also industry certification, voluntary certification programs that producers produce their product to. And sometimes I think those could be reviewed more frequently, because the pace of change in our industry, the rate at which innovation is happening and coming to market and changing what's possible is so fast now that, if you're going to review a standard every 3 to 5 years, you're really not keeping up with what's possible in the industry. So I think that's a really important change that needs to happen as well.
Right. Yeah, good one. Question from Armin Ramirez. What is the impact on pellet physical quality for you, Cliff? Is the barley adding binding properties? I love how detailed this is going today.
It seems to add binding properties. Again, my expertise is not formulating final pelleted feeds, but in the tests that were run both in the U.S. and in Europe, it the pellets came out equal to or superior to what they were making now. The binding qualities of the barley have been good. Not too, and again, it depends on inclusion rates and things, but we went up to 30% in some of the studies, and the pellets were fine.
What about, did you have to supplement any amino acids compared to your soy? Because you compared to soy, right? Or you replaced fish and soy? Okay.
We've been replacing both soy and or fish meal. We've, as other grains, barley's a little bit short in lysine and methionine. And when you get up to really high inclusion rates, they did supplement. Fortunately, those amino acids are fairly low cost, so it really doesn't add much to the total.
But compared to, soy is also lacking those two, right? So
yes,
do you have more or less than soy, or you don't know?
It's a little bit. Actually, it's a little bit more of lysine. If I can get this straight, one's a little bit more than the other than soy, and the one's a little bit less. It's not a significant difference, and they both need to be supplemented at high inclusion rates. But soy, for the most part, is not used at inclusion rates where that becomes limiting. It's maybe 10 or 15% because of anti-nutritional factors and things. So there's enough limiting amino acids from the fish meal still in the feeds to not be an issue. For us, it's been an issue only when we get up, when we get up 30, 40% inclusion rate, then we've had to supplement.
Right. That's a lot. Let's be real. That's going to be 20, 15, 20%. Yeah.
And the cost savings in replacing that much more fish meal is much greater than the small additional cost of adding some amino acids. If you're taking out $1,500 a ton fish meal and replacing it with soy protein prices, you can afford some amino acids.
Yes, but you are also going, obviously, in that there's no omega-3s in your oil fraction. There's probably certain palatability issues that you might experience with salmon that you didn't see in trout. I don't know. I guess you've done salmon too, so yeah.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work in salmon, and we have never tried to replace. We've worked with feeds that have primarily vegetable oils in them, but still have a little bit of fish oil, and again, that's for palatability issues.
Okay.
And so we've not tried to replace oils. We've worked with people who.
Sorry.
We've worked with feed people who've worked on that, but we haven't done that.
Yeah. Here's another great question. Does the storage of the barley influence the quality and quantity of protein that can be extracted? Or can you produce throughout the whole year? Or are you limited to the harvest times? Question from Jan.
In climates, as long as the barley is kept dry, it's storable for a long period of time. So if it gets wet and moldy, then you can't use it. But as long as you have good storage and dry, which is not, for grain farmers, that's not an issue. So we can produce all year at a steady rate. We can contract for barley, so that's not an issue.
And how do you, so just your first factory that's currently being built, how large, what's the protein capacity?
I don't want to get into specifics. The two of them will be when they're the European and the U.S. plants, when they're finished, will be right about 70,000 tons of protein as a first scale. Together. And both of them are expandable, and our agreements with both companies are to expand production significantly over the first 5 years of our agreements. So we expect to be well over 100,000 tons within 5 years, 4 years actually.
Right. So for reference, there's about, I think, 650,000 tons of soy protein corns produced in Norway alone. So every year, so you've got some way
growth
to go.
Potential.
You've got some growth potential, yes. So a question for Ian, I think you might have said that before, but is from Armin Ramirez, is Veramaris approved to be used in the United States for aquafeed?
Yes, it is. Yeah, pleased to say that it is.
Okay, here's another one. how could mycotoxins impact alternative proteins and oils in aquafeeds? So that's also an interesting one, since mycotoxins seems to be a huge problem, and there must be some sort of effect on changing the ingredients, right? Is there either of you, Ian, with your background, maybe do you have an opinion on that, or maybe do you sell whole algae, or do you extract the oil before you sell the algae?
Yeah, it's not really relevant for our products as far as I'm aware, because it's the oil is extracted from the whole algal cell, and then the co-product is used for other purposes. So I don't think mycotoxins would be an issue with the algal oil. So therefore, I'm not sure that that's relevant in the case of Veramaris.
Interesting.
That is probably relevant in the case of barley, because you can get Fusarium as a fungus that infects barley and makes mycotoxins. We deal with that by good quality control on the incoming barley. There's a specification, and actually the technology exists now to do a real-time test of incoming barley to a plant. I mean, you actually sample it and run an assay before the truck unloads to tell you whether you have any mycotoxin issues or not. And so we just deal with it by not having any mycotoxins in the barley that's coming in to begin with as a quality control check.
Okay. My last.
I think that Carsten, maybe with the M&A play that was announced last week with DSM, maybe DSM will be able to help with that in the future.
Right, exactly. So Bioma, so DSM is acquiring the Erber Group, whose main asset is Bioma, and Bioma's main products are on mycotoxins. So that would have been my last question for you, Ian. Anyway, how you think this will affect your business? It's just some industry gossip, because it's obviously a huge transaction. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, it is. It's great to see these transactions taking place, and it's Biomin, not Biomar. But
did I say Biomar? I meant Biomin, obviously.
At least I heard Biomar, so I'm
no.
But for Veramaris, it doesn't have any specific bearing. I think this is an acquisition that's being done by DSM, and DSM is one of our joint venture partners. But for them, I think it's a great move, and it brings capabilities in mycotoxins and eubiotics to add to the portfolio that DSM already has. So watch the space. It sounds like a very exciting move.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, very last question, back to Cliff, and then we'll finish it off. Nathan is asking, how variable is your product composition? So Ian's, I understand, will always be the same. One of his great features of fermenting or using fermentation the same raw material always leads to the same product. Obviously, you using barley, Cliff, how variable is your product, and thereby then your protein concentrate?
Well, that's an excellent question, because barley varies a lot in composition when it's coming in. We have a certain specification that we accept barley for. It's not difficult to meet, but it's effective. And we've been able to maintain protein concentrations within a plus or minus 1% or so by controlling incoming barley, by process good control, quality control in the process. So it doesn't vary much on the product side. It's pretty consistent. And if all else fails, we can blend a little bit. If we get a really high protein from one barley and a little bit lower from another, you can blend to get your 65%. We've been fairly constant with that. It took us we operated a pilot plant for almost 2 years to get this right. So
perfect. Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Cliff. That has been great in detail conversation. I would also like to thank the audience for asking so many questions and nerding out about Aquafeed ingredients. And yes, we're gonna have further webinars like this scheduled. We don't have a date yet, but we'll let you know. And the topics are going to be slightly different, but they'll also going to be around Aquafeed and other aquaculture technologies. So I hope to have everyone back for the next one. And thanks again, Ian, Cliff, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.